the same way that you have to decide who we are, you have to decide who we are not. And that's going to be needs to be deeply embedded in the decisions that you make. And when you make certain decisions that you think are important and emblematic, I think it's important that those are communicated. So if an organization makes a decision, for example, not to support a particular course of action or a particular cause, I think it's really important that that decision is communicated so that everybody knows we made this decision for this reason.
Hi, welcome to the Gripe podcast. In this podcast, we learn how to grow mission-driven organizations. I'm your host Farhad Khan, CEO of Gripe. If you want to grow the membership of your professional association, please take a look at the workshops on our website at gripe.ca/services. That is grype.ca/services. In this episode, I speak to Aydin Mirzaee, CEO of Fellow. Aydin is a serial entrepreneur, and in fact, if you're involved in the business community here in Ottawa, it's actually difficult not to know Aydin. Aydin's current startup focuses on improving the performance of managers and their teams. So today, we will hear from Aydin what it takes to build and maintain a high-performing team in your organization. Here's the interview. Hi, Aydin. Great to have you on our show today.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. This is exciting.
Yeah, it took us only 1 year to get you on our podcast, but I'm so glad we did.
Better late than never.
Absolutely. So, Aydin, can you start by telling us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. I've been an entrepreneur basically my whole life. So I started. My last company was interesting. It was called Fluidware, and we actually worked a lot with nonprofits and associations, and some of your audience may know the product from that time. But we had a product called Fluid Survey, so it was an online survey product, and then we also had a product called Fluid Review. And today that product is rebranded to be called SurveyMonkey Apply because our company was acquired by SurveyMonkey. And so both products joined the SurveyMonkey family. But yeah, so that's kind of like, and obviously SurveyMonkey is used a lot by both associations and nonprofits, all across the globe. So I know more than you would think about the space in working with them for probably maybe even close to a decade. So that's kind of like where my, the last part of my career has been. And since then, I've recently in the last few years left SurveyMonkey. And although, as I mentioned, I'm still a shareholder, I love the company and I wish it all the success in the world. But I've now started a new company called Fellow. And so Fellow is basically a tool for managers and their teams to work better together. It's primarily focused on meetings. So our slogan is great meetings are just the start. So all sorts of there's so many types of meetings. There's one-on-ones and team meetings and brainstorming sessions and project syncs. Any manager in any organization anywhere knows that they have a lot of meetings. And so for those meetings to be great, we created Fellow. And so that's where that comes from.
That's great, Aydin. And yeah, so we have been working with associations for around a decade as well. And what we are finding working with many associations is not all of them have great teams to start with. So Aydin, if I'm an association leader right now, if I'm a business exec over there, an association, where do I start in building a great team?
Yeah, so I would say that there's greatness in every team. You just have to find it and coordinate it and sync it up so that it's tuned. There's this constant, if you own a piano, that basically the way it works is, when the piano is not if you just left your piano for a few years, you have to actually, let's even go for when you buy a piano. When you first buy a piano, they kind of put it in your house. And you just leave it there, and they're not going to come tune it right away because they kind of want it to settle into place and kind of, it's a new environment for it to settle a bit. And then the tuner might come in and, tune it once. And then maybe a few months later, they tune it again. And a few months later, they tune it again. And eventually, basically, if you leave it, even once it's fully tuned, the idea is that like you still have to tune it afterwards. Like it's never you just leave it and forget it. And I think a lot of this is, the same with a team. So any team, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And, that's what managers of teams do. So it's a constant, never ending, responsibility that managers have. So it's really interesting because we have very strong views on this particular point. So we think that great teams are not about the individual, any specific individual contributor. When you talk to a lot of people, they think about teams as like, oh yeah, well, I don't know, that team has a Michael Jordan on there. And so they're an all-star. And so that's why the team is great. But the reality is that's actually not true. A team is only great because people have learned to work really well together. And, there's been a lot of studies on this, by the way. So, for example, they have studied surgeons that were basically like the best surgeon in a particular hospital. And they followed those surgeons around and said like, well, is that also true when these surgeons go to all these other hospitals? And it turns out that it's actually not true. The only time where it is true is if the team actually, the same set of like team that was with that surgeon actually followed them around. Same as with financial analysts. They found that if they take a rock star financial analyst and they put him into another company, it turns out that they're not a rock star anymore. And it can take up to 5 years for them to regain that status. And the reason for that is because, and the only exception is if they actually move with their team. So there's a lot to be said about a team. And again, one of the things that we feel very strongly is that the person that has the most influence on whether a team can perform well or not is actually the manager of the team. So this is I just wanted to pre-frame this to say that this is an incredible responsibility and it's incredibly powerful because you can actually create a super high performing 10x culture strictly by learning how to do this craft of management. So the question is like, how do you do it? So, if you have the luxury to create the team from scratch, that's one thing. But like you said, what if you're just like parachuted in? Like, what do you do? And so, there is actually a playbook of what you can do. And, the first is, and this might seem kind of like an obvious thing, which is make sure that you actually have one-on-ones with each and every person on the team. And, oftentimes when, this is a suggestion, especially in smaller organizations, so say you're like 20 to 30 people, a common response might be, oh yeah, well, I don't really need to do that. I mean, I sit right next to my team. I talk to them every day. I don't need to, like, this one-on-one thing. Yeah, that's maybe like an end of year performance review thing. I don't really need to do this. But that's actually like, a fatal flaw. Like that is one of the worst mistakes you could possibly make as a manager. These one-on-ones, by the way, like obviously we're recording this during pandemic time, so it's no longer true that you sit with your team. So if that was an excuse before, that crutch is now removed. But even if you are sitting with your team, so here's a reality. Like the thing that you want to discuss during one-on-one, there's so many things, but one of the most important as it relates here is to like really deeply know the person, the people that you're working with. And so amongst those things are really deeply understanding someone's strengths, really deeply understanding someone's weaknesses. And so here's where the magic comes in. It's not about figuring out their weaknesses and helping them to improve it. It's actually figuring out like what you can do to orchestrate a structure where they can actually put on display their strengths a lot more often. And like the key role of a manager is to, again, they're like this orchestrator of the team where they can like position people into the right places so that more often they're able to bring their strengths to work. And that's often a very good question, which is like, if you ask your team this particular question, how often basically, are you able to exhibit your strengths at work? That is a very interesting question, and I recommend that everybody in their next one-on-ones ask that of one of their direct reports and see how they respond. And so your role is to make that happen more often. I mean, there's many more things, but I would start with understand your team really well and then position them to use their strengths more often every day.
Absolutely. And Aydin, I don't always hear people saying this, that as opposed to focusing on the weaknesses, we should really try and amplify people's strengths. That one in itself is so powerful, so powerful. Thank you for that.
I mean, I'm just going to add there too, because I mean, you and I know this, right? Like in the business world, like how do you create a company? It's oftentimes you try a bunch of things, and then the things that work, you do more of them. You don't try and like always go, oh, we're not very good at this, we should do this more. That's not what you say. You're like, hey, we've got this, let's do more of this, right? So inherently, like this concept is everywhere. Double down on your strengths. It applies to so many areas of life, management included.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Aydin, in a scenario where you think that we had a one-on-one with a team member, and then what a manager is finding is that there are many challenges working with a team member. So maybe he had heard complaints or this and that, to a point that there may not be a lot that can be done to actually make a person more productive. So how do you approach a scenario like that?
I mean, again, so it's super hard to kind of like just diagnose, because these things are so often obviously context related. But again, like if you actually understand a person really, really well, and you really understand that person, and not just their strengths and weaknesses, but things like how well does this person, like how would this person like to receive feedback? So this is a very interesting question in itself, right? And another thing that I think every single manager in the world should ask every single person on their team, because people will tell you different things. They'll tell you like, yeah, I mean, I don't want you to actually do it in public in front of other people. I want you to do it in private. Or like, if you send me something over Slack or whatever else chatting platform, that's okay too. Some people like praise in public. Other people don't like praise in public. There's so many different variations. And I think this is an important thing to figure out. So, the first question I would ask is, if you're in a situation where you're like, well, this person is not working out and is not being productive, my first question to you is, does that person know that you think that? And even more important than that, have you actually set expectations with that person? Because very often we don't do that, right? So we have these assumptions of, well, I believe that this person should kind of like act in this way. Why? Because I knew someone somewhere that, kind of set that expectation level with me. Great. So like, have you actually communicated that with the person? So the view is that, in a very kind of like, transparent way, to say, here are my expectations of your role, and here's what I believe success looks like in your role. And like, let's actually now talk about where the facts are, right? And so this is, what's actually happening. And so my expectations are here, and, this is what I'm seeing on the ground. Like, maybe we can actually explore that in a bit more detail. Now, ultimately, not every single person is a fit for every single job, but I think it's really important to get to a point where expectations have been set. It's very well understood that, the performance is, say, not where your expectations are, and that you've actually tried to give the appropriate feedback to ensure that like the person actually knows. Very often, I think, some people are very quick to jump to, wow, this person won't work. Like, it's over, right? But, if you went to have that conversation with that person, my question is, when you're about to have that conversation, are they going to be surprised that you're going to have that conversation? Or are they going to be like, yeah, I know, I agree, I don't think this role is a right fit for me, right? So this isn't a, like, so my main advice there would be, again, like, if the expectations are set, the feedback is given, and you jointly determine that this role may not be the best fit for that person, then it's not a matter of like you being evil. As a matter of fact, you can actually argue that you are being helpful, because why would you waste someone's time in a role that's not meant for them and they're not happy in? What if like they could find something that they truly enjoy, and they could be world class or best in the world at that? And so again, so I don't view it as like it's not working out, it's over. It's not a binary situation. There's a lot to be done around it. That's why I say that like it's never too late. It's never too late to start having these one-on-one conversations, to deeply understand the people that you work with. And again, like everybody's on the same page, right? So the organization has a mission. We're here to together achieve this mission. We all have our goals. And they need to work together. And so again, this is where the manager comes in, has to figure this stuff out. And ultimately, if sometimes it's not a fit, but sometimes the expectations have never been set. And you'd be surprised that like when you go to have that conversation, sometimes the other person will say, oh, wow, like I never knew that you actually wanted those things. And so that's really strange that you want that. But now that I know that, I can definitely do something about it. So again, very nuanced, but I hope there are some helpful tips in that.
No, for sure, for sure. So Aydin, doing these one-on-one discussions actually take a lot of time in general. And as a manager and business leader, I know it myself, having a number of like people reporting to me. It can easily fill up your calendar. Now, how often would you recommend people do the one-on-ones with their team?
Yeah, so I'm sure you've read this. You've read basically what is high output management. That's a book I'm looking for. So it's a great book. Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel, kind of like a Bible here in like management, at least in the tech world. A lot of people would agree with me that it's one of the best management books ever written. And he talks about this in great length, but the rule of thumb is that the more junior someone is into a role, you probably need to be a little bit more frequent. The more that person like understands the expectations and is thriving and is doing really well and surpassing expectations, the less that you need to do this often. So for example, if you're a Fortune 500 company, you probably, and everybody's style is different, and one-on-ones can have different goals. But all that to say is that, the more junior someone is, you probably need to meet with them more often. And when they're more senior, you probably don't have to do it as often. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't communicate with the person. A one-on-one is a very specific type of meeting. But like you should obviously have project meetings and, staff meetings and those sorts of things. That's a completely separate bucket. I do want to make that clear. It doesn't mean that just because someone's senior, you can say, hi, great to meet you. See you next year. Right. So that's not what I'm saying. But as it relates to specific one-on-one type conversations, which are very focused on feedback, which are very focused on helping someone clear roadblocks, which are focused on career development, those things, that's kind of the variability. But if I had to just like choose a number to give you like a rule of thumb that you could just blanket apply to everyone, I would say once every 2 weeks is a good cadence.
Okay, that's great. That's great. All right. So Aydin, now say that we have a solid team already and we're looking to grow at this point, and we kind of like know what type of people we want to bring into the company. Now, what would be a good hiring process for you?
Yeah. So what I would say for hiring, again, a great book that I would recommend everybody read is this book called Who. And it's one of the best books that I've read on hiring, but there's a few important things. So I think that especially when an organization is small, they may not do some of these things. So the first things first is let's actually figure out like what the job description is and put that stuff down. But B, let's actually figure out what are the specific strengths that we're looking for in this role. Like there's obviously some skill sets that you definitely want to see. And then there's obviously also some characteristics that would be very good. I think what happens often during hiring, again, just going back to the strengths and weakness point, is that the goal of hiring is not to hire for the lack of weakness, but it's actually to find a person who's really strong in the most important attribute that you're looking for in that role. Again, because if you're looking for a lack of weakness, I will congratulate you for probably hiring a very mediocre person, because there's like very few people in the world that are good at everything. And so the thing is, like, if this person was horrific at everything but they were good at just one thing, like extraordinary at that one thing, what would that one thing be? And to basically ask those sorts of questions ahead of time, and then kind of determine that what are the series of questions and things that we're going to do in order to evaluate whether or not the people that we're meeting are actually going to meet that criteria. The other thing I'm going to say is that, it's very important, especially that for organizations, I mean, we should talk about this too. I don't know if you're going to ask about it, but just from like a values perspective, every organization is going to have a set of values. And it's really important that A, those are transcribed and written down, but B, those are available on your hiring website and those are communicated, because you kind of want to subtly express that, these are the things that we believe in as an organization. And during the interview process, what you want to do is you want to ask questions that kind of, gets at whether or not like this person actually, fits into that criteria. And then the final thing I'll add is that it's really important that for any particular position that you have, that you really keep diversity in mind. So it doesn't mean that you should, basically, hire just for diversity's sake. But the one thing that I think it is a responsibility for people to do is to make sure that your candidate pipeline is diverse. Like, you can actually go out. It is completely reasonable, and I think a good idea, for you to basically do more to ensure that the pipeline of candidates that you have has a diverse mix in there. But then obviously you want to hire the best person for the job, but there's no excuse for not having a pipeline that is, has diverse candidates. So I think, and that's important for 100 different reasons. It's actually good for business and good for your mission, because you don't really want, a group of people that are just like you.
Yeah.
Like, this is how grave some of the world's worst mistakes have ever been made. And so, yeah, I mean, these are some of the factors that I would consider. I think the number one mistake that people make during hiring is they hire for lack of weakness rather than like hire for strengths. Like, and so, yeah, those are some of the things that I think are really important.
All right. Aydin, thanks for touching on company values. I think this is so important that the candidate's values align with yours. Now, I'll play a bit of a devil's advocate here. Now, if you have already outlined some of your values in your on your company website and on the job posting, isn't it easy for a candidate to kind of like game the system and tell you what you want to hear?
Yeah, I mean, if someone is, if they're out to do that, I'm sure that like they can kind of work their way to try to, but it is hard to do though, because, you don't want to subtly, okay, so we're not going to, basically create, a slideshow for them and say, here's company value 1. What do you think? Is that a good value? So it's not so much that, and it's not so much, hey, did you ever exhibit this value? It's more like, let me ask you a story. Like, let me ask you about, something in your work experience. And for me to actually try and derive from that, whether or not, you would experience, like whether or not you had that value. So for example, say that like one of our values was, teams come first, right? And so you're talking to this person about their experiences and they're like taking credit for everything. They're like, I did this and I did that, and because of me, and, so on and so forth. So that might not be someone that exhibits, like prioritizing like their team over other things, right? So, I mean, there's subtle hints that you can get through asking questions. And I think what you want to do in the interview prep is basically come up with a series of questions through which you can figure out the values alignment, but without directly asking for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Now, Aiden, I want to touch on conflict management within the team. So I've had cases again and again where maybe two of the team members in the team will not fully agree on the things that they're doing, but even with the disagreements, they kind of like agree to disagree and continue, or maybe they don't actually solve the problem at all. So how would you address conflicts like that in general?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of conflicts, again, like these are very nuanced questions, and I'm trying to come up with a template to solve them. But I mean, there's some facts that are true, right? So, a common scenario is someone comes to you, Farhad, and says, "Hey, like this other person is a real jerk, for
Yeah.
whatever reason, or he's just not performing, or something like this." So I think the tendency is like, okay, I'll go talk to him, uh, but like the right approach here is actually to say, well, it's interesting. Like, have you talked to him about that? And it's more so that you want to let people resolve their own issues together, and not really have conversations in silo like that. It's more about, and sometimes it makes sense that, the three of you get together and chat about, a situation directly. But I think like when there is conflict, it makes sense to address it head on, because, the longer that something is not addressed, like the worse that it becomes. So when there is a situation, like, get the monster while it's little,
Yeah.
before it becomes like, this big issue. So I would say try and address it. And I feel like in many cases, again, it's super hard to generalize about this stuff. But what I would say is in many cases, conflicts arise because of a lack of understanding. Now, the lack of understanding may be actually because you didn't do a good job in clarifying something, or the instructions were not clear, or maybe you need to create an SLA, service level agreement,
Mhm.
between two different teams so that they can actually define how they need to work together. So again, a lot of times misunderstandings or lack of clarity can actually lead to conflicts. And the other thing that I'll say about this is like very often, uh, so not necessarily just in the nonprofit world, but say call it like in any world, there's certain teams, for example, that are going to have very stereotypical disagreements with each other and can be at each other's throats, not necessarily like that dramatically, but can have disagreements with each other. So for example, any sales team will normally say we don't get enough leads for marketing, and marketing teams will typically say, like, these salespeople waste all of our leads, as an example, right? So there's many, there's customer success teams and engineering teams, like very often, that have these like very stereotypical disagreements. So all this to say is like sometimes disagreements are caused by the system and not the actors in the system. So I think like it's really important to say, like, is this actually a systematic thing? So if I actually plopped in a different person into this role, are they likely to also run into, a certain disagreement because the system actually conjures up those things? So, I mean, that's an important question to ask. But yeah, I mean, to summarize it, is this a systematic problem? Is it actually a people problem? Is this really like a fundamental disagreement, or is this just like a lack of clarity, a misunderstanding of sorts? Most of the time, it will be. And the other thing is like, sometimes it's really important when you have certain values in the company that those values, are often, talked about during disagreements and kind of like emphasized to help solve, some of those problems too.
Right, right. So going back to values again, when you have a new hire, it's also important for us to onboard the new hire really well so that he's in tune with the values that the company already has. So how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things obviously is an employee handbook of
Hmm.
sorts is always a really good idea. So one interesting, there's so many really cool and well done employee handbooks out there. I'm going to actually recommend reading one that is very out there and very different, because uh, every company has theirs, but I think one that is like particularly interesting is the Valve company handbook. If you're into gaming, you would know about Valve. And anyway, they have a super fascinating and interesting handbook. And the reason why it's interesting is because they have a very different structure than most organizations or companies in the world. And so it's just interesting that it's particularly instructive because in a company that is so different than every other company, they don't have traditional roles. They don't have traditional like mandates on like how many people should be on a particular team. Like people can recruit each other to work on a project. Like it's a very interesting sort of company. And all this to say is like in that kind of an environment, like the employee handbook is ever more important. So, and obviously, a good portion of the employee handbook should obviously be the company values. So that's got to be in there. But the other thing is, some of the best leaders that I know make it a point to, especially if your organization is larger. So it's one thing for a 20-person company to say this, but if you're like 500, if you're a 500-person organization, I think it's actually important that the CEO or the executive director set some time aside with any new cohort of employees or interns or volunteers to actually sit down and go through these things. Because again, it's this concept of creating alignment. For an organization to work together, it's not so much about like dictating exactly what needs to be done. What's really important is that you get aligned on the big things. Again, there's this term that we often use in managing teams, which is be highly aligned and loosely coupled, meaning that like obviously give independence to the teams, but you've got to agree on like a lot of the fundamentals. So anytime that you actually spend in drilling into fundamentals into teams, I think that's a super valuable effort, and it's absolutely worth the time.
Aydin, so I want to dig into this employee handbook a little more because a lot of the organizations that I work with, I'm pretty sure they don't have one at all. So what would you put in the employee handbook? Like some rough ideas maybe?
Yeah. So, and again, we don't have to make these things super complex, and it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to basically be this dramatic, effort, because your employee handbook is always going to vary, right? It's going to be something that as your organization evolves and grows, and the times change, right? And the times can change, as we know very well. You might have to make some changes and pivot and change direction. And so it's an ever evolving thing. But at a very minimum, I think there's this concept of, I believe that there should be almost like a letter from the CEO or executive director, almost as like a welcome to the team. Here's what our mission is. Here's what we're about. Here's what our history is. And history is really important, right? Because a lot of people that come in don't have the context of where the roots of this organization are, what it stands for. And it's really about, a lot of the stuff that, you would want basically on the about page of your website. And I think like most organizations will at least have an about page. So at the very least, it's that, but maybe it's a little bit deeper, just to going into to building the context, talking about the values, talking about things that your organization does, what the different teams do within the organization. Like it's really kind of like this explanation of like, how do you figure out how to be successful within this organization when you join? And as long as you can communicate that, you can communicate the principles, the history, the values. I think like that at a very minimum, if it's done, is a really big step in the right direction.
All right. Now, going to the next step from there. Say we are trying to build a solid company culture. You have some good people already, and for the next step for you would be to actually build a good culture. Like, how would you go about doing that?
So I think like when we talk about a good culture, so this is so we have to define what a culture is, right? So I think it's really some people may think that a culture is, hey, we have these perks, and we play basketball all together on Wednesdays, or some random variation of that, or we have team lunches, and a lot of that is really important, right? So, but it's not really the perks. It's a culture is the things that your organization tends to do often, right? So, for example, if you live in the South, say you live in Texas, as an example, like southern states are known for their hospitality, right? Like that's just a trait that they have, and it's part of their culture. And I think if you look at certain companies, say for example, an Amazon, they have this culture of, we want to be frugal internally, and then we want to pass on the savings to our customers, right? And so that frugality and passing on the savings to their customers is just very deeply rooted. It's part of their culture. And so one of the most effective ways, in my opinion, of conveying the culture of a company is through having stories, having stories and things that, people can reference, because, humans are, if you've, ever read Sapiens, which also it's a great book, I highly recommend. Is humans are all about storytelling. Like this is one of the things that differentiates us, and I think that we are all prone to hearing stories. And if there's a story of, well, Jeff Bezos, was in the early days of the company would take a desk from Home Depot, and he turns that into a door from Home Depot, and he turns that into a desk because it turns out that would be cheaper. And that's a story that like every intern and every employee knows about. Well, that's going to stick. Or if there's a story of, the way that you did customer success was that, a customer, indicated basically in a forum somewhere that, their favorite snack was M&Ms. When they show up to, a business meeting to have a bowl of M&Ms for them, or, like that's going above and beyond, but it's basically like a story. Or we had a customer, you talk about like, how do you hire for the right values? I remember there's this one person that we hired that joined our customer support and success team. And during his interview, he told me this story about how he used to work in hotel management, and he had a situation where the hotel was actually booked up. And there was this guest that needed, to stay there, and they had overbooked the hotel. And so he literally said to the guest, "Hey, I have a basement. I know it's not ideal and you don't know me, but under the circumstances, if you'd like, you can stay in my house, in my basement." And that person actually did, and apparently they still keep in touch many years later. So all that to say is, but a story like that, if I'm the manager of that hotel and like that actually happened, obviously there might be legal ramifications in endorsing something like that. I don't know. But the point is that stories are things that people remember. You can come up with all the slogans in the world, but if there aren't like concrete stories or examples that people can go back to, I think it's harder for people to really understand what a particular value or way of being actually is. So I think stories, analogies, like these are all very powerful things to influence the culture you want. But the other thing is like, you also have to decide, right? So in the same way that you have to decide who we are, you have to decide who we are not. And that's going to be needs to be deeply embedded in the decisions that you make. And when you make certain decisions that you think are important and emblematic, I think it's important that those are communicated. So if an organization makes a decision, for example, not to support a particular course of action or a particular cause, I think it's really important that that decision is communicated so that everybody knows we made this decision for this reason. And sometimes, again, I think the trap that you can fall into is to care too much about whether or not your organization or like every single employee in your organization likes and approves a course of action or the way that you're going. But it's not actually about being liked. If you're liked by everyone, first of all, that's actually impossible. But again, that's a path to mediocrity. It's much more important to be understood than it is to be liked.
All right. Now, in terms of being liked by your subordinates, I guess as a manager, how much autonomy do you want to give your team members in general? Because you want to empower them and you actually want them to be creative. But where would you draw the line, Aydin?
Yeah. I think, again, like this is where it's really important that you get to know your team very well, because again, like different people are going to operate in different kind of environments, and are probably, some people like more contact, some people like less contact. And I think it's really important to determine that. But what I would say is that, like, the best thing that you can do is not to tell people exactly what to do, because I as I'm also the host of this this podcast called Super Managers. And we had just recently we had this guest call his name is Eran Aloni. He's the COO of Gong.io, and he was talking about this concept of trust. And it was really interesting. I had asked him, so tell me, like, how do you diagnose if a team has trust or not between the manager and the team? And he said that if there is too much command and control, if you feel like you have to almost force basically a certain point of being, or you have to be more autocratic, then clearly there's a lack of trust in that team. There's a lack of trust from you, the manager, that the team will actually do. And it comes across in that sense. It's often said that you really want to, like at the highest level, especially at the organizational leadership level, you want to focus on the why, right? Like the principles, like why are we doing this, and making sure that everybody's highly aligned there. And at the like frontline manager level, you also want to focus on, like, what are we doing? What needs to be done? But you often want to leave the how to the actual, team members, because if you also define the how, you're babying these employees, right? And B, they're never going to develop the skills they need to be able to do the how in the future, and there's going to be less ownership. So when something goes wrong, well, guess what? You wrote the whole playbook and the whole roadmap, and they followed it, and it didn't go well. Well, it's not their fault. So how could you possibly hold them accountable? If you want to drive accountability, the key to actually having an accountable team is to make sure that team actually has ownership. One of my favorite books, actually, probably my most favorite biography, is called Shoe Dog. It's the story of Nike. Phil Knight, founder, wrote the book, and he constantly, it's really interesting. Like, he references this so many times in his book, which is like, don't tell people the what, but let them impress you with the how. And he constantly has to remind himself of this thing. And I think this is, in general, a difficult thing for new managers in particular. Like, especially if you were like the best in your individual contributor role and now you're a manager. Oh man, it is so hard to let go of that. But that's the thing. You have to, you constantly remind yourself, because nobody wants to work for a dictator. They just don't. If they, this is something that you have to figure out. And teams like to develop, people like to grow, and your role is to be a facilitator of that.
Absolutely. Now, Aydin, we are running out of time for today. You and I can talk about this forever, I know. Now, if you had one key takeaway for organizations like, say, nonprofits or professional associations in building a strong team, what would be your key message for them?
Yeah. So in building a strong team, I would say that if you're not already doing one-on-one meetings, I would say that it's really important that you do them, and you do them really, really well. And if you're looking for how to do one-on-ones really, really well, so my company, Fellow, we wrote this great ebook. It's kind of like the de facto guide for one-on-one meetings. It's actually called The Art of the One-on-One Meeting. It's 90 pages. Don't worry, it's not all text. There's pictures. It's not like 90 pages of, we've done a lot of work. We spent a year compiling all the best resources, all the best books and expert advice. And we've kind of distilled it into this one ebook that you can download for free on the internet. And if you like what you read, obviously I would recommend people also check out fellow.app, which is the product that we build, and super easy to use. And, managers use it with their teams. We have tens of thousands of employees using it. Has a really great free version. So I'd recommend people try that as well.
All right. So Aydin, to wrap up, is there a personal habit that you have that you think might have led to your success?
I think that, so it's interesting. What I would say is that your question itself has the answer in it, which is, I think one of the most important and overlooked concepts is actually the concept of a habit. And I think it's particularly important for everybody to be hyper conscious of the habits that they have, the habits that they build, because habits are extremely difficult to get rid of, especially bad habits are extremely difficult to get rid of.
Yep.
And good habits are really, really difficult to take on. But I actually think that, the right set of habits can do more for a person's trajectory to success than anything else. So be careful in the habits that you build, be very conscious of them, and systematically work to develop them. And if you want a really great book on habits, again, one of the best books I've ever read, it's called The Power of Habit. I believe Charles Duhigg is so incredible book. Recommend everybody check that out. And be conscious of the habits that you build. They can actually be your most valuable asset.
That's amazing. Aydin, is there a digital tool or strategy that you use that makes you effective in your work?
So, I mean, we all use Fellow. Obviously internally at the company, we use it. Every single employee uses it every single day. And I recommend people check it out. It just basically takes all the different habits and things that managers and their teams should do together, and then obviously makes it easy so that everybody can do them.
Amazing. So Aydin, where can people reach you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, definitely. So I am on Twitter, so at Aydin, at AYDIN. And I'm also the host of the Super Managers podcast, which you can find obviously on iTunes and Spotify and all the places typically where you go to find podcasts. It's all about management and leadership. That's all we talk about. So if you liked what you heard here, there's a lot more of it there too.
Absolutely. I know you have to run. So Aydin, thank you so much for your time today.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Alrighty. We should do this again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was fun.
That was the interview with our guest today. I always learn quite a bit in our podcast interviews, and I hope you will be able to use some of the ideas in this episode for your organization soon. Once again, if you want to grow the membership of your professional association, do check out the workshops on our website at grype.ca/services. That is grype.ca/services. Alright? I look forward to speaking to you in one of our future episodes. Bye for now.